Hey, what's up, good people? Welcome back to another episode of Mono to Atmos. And today, indeed, we have a very interesting topic set for discussion. And the interesting thing about today is that it marks the beginning of our tutorials. We've been having quite a number of theories, but even before we set into the tutorials, we need to go through a few things such that if someone is a complete beginner, they're not left out. And also, if you're a professional, you're able to understand where we are coming from and where we are going. So today's topic is going to be creating Pro Tools post-film sound template in stereo. We'll be creating a film post-sound film template in both stereo and 5.1, but we'll start with stereo because once you understand the fundamentals of how to create a template in stereo, it becomes very easy for you to be able to do it in 5.1 or in any other format 7.1 that you might want. Dolby Atmos is slightly different because how Dolby Atmos works is it uses beds and objects, which when we get to it, we'll discuss. But before we jump into Dolby Atmos, it's important that we start with the fundamentals. So remember, this is mono to Atmos, and for this reason, we go up step by step. We have to figure out, first of all, what stereo is, and then from stereo, we can move to some of the slightly immersive playback systems like 5.1, and then maybe we'll move to Atmos as time will allow. So today we will be creating Pro Tools post-sound film template for Netflix, Showmax, and Mnet. And remember, Showmax and Mnet are actually just the same company. One does cable, the other does online. Netflix is an online TV. And before we get to creating the template, I would want us to just go through some cleanup and just discuss a few things that we'll be doing. So let's just begin from the onset. So what is a template? A Pro Tools template is a pre-configured session file containing organized tracks, routing, plugins, settings tailored to a specific type of project, in this case, film post-production. So a template is just a pre-configured session file. And why would we want to do this? Because there are reasons why we want to pre-configure our session file. So once you have pre-configured your sessions file, you realize that it gives you an ease of use such that every time you want to start a project, assuming that you're working for Showmax and they've given you maybe 10 episodes that you need to work on, or you're working for Mnet and they've given you 100 episodes that you're supposed to work on, or even just Netflix, they've given you 8 or 9 episodes or 7 episodes, you need a template that you should be able to customize such that it meets the deliverables of these different platforms, okay? So let's talk about why a template is necessary. Number one, it saves time. So every time let's assume you've been given a couple of episodes, and when you're given a couple of episodes, you don't have to create a template every time you are starting out an episode. So what you do is you create one template, and then all the episodes will just be, you'll be opening them through that template. The other thing is that it ensures consistency. I remember when I was starting out in the music industry, there's something that we call mastering, music mastering. And the idea behind the music mastering was the fact that you expected all the music on your CD, then when you're using CD, to have the same sonic capacity, to have the same equalization, to have the same loudness across the CD, such that if someone was playing this CD on their CD player and it was at night, you don't have songs with different volume levels. So that we used to do mastering for CDs in order to attain consistency, not just in terms of volume, but also in terms of sonics or even equalization. And so this templates will allow you to have whatever episodes that you're working on whatever channel, let's say it's Showmax or even if it's Netflix, that the first episode to the last episode are all consistent in terms of loudness, but also in terms of sonics. The other thing that it does and it helps us to do is it helps us to adhere to technical standards. Remember that all of these platforms have their own technical standards for which whatever you've done will be subject to quality control. So assuming you've done your post sound and you take it to Netflix, it is going to go through a process of quality control, and if it fails, it'll have to come back for corrections. Now, we really want to avoid this whole thing of back and forth in terms of corrections. Why? It eats your time, it eats your energy, it eats into your resources. For instance, if you've done your project, it goes ahead and fails QC. It means while you should be doing another project that is bringing in an income, you'll be busy still trying to make corrections and you'll be losing on revenue. So to just ensure that you adhere to technical standards, you need to come up with a template that will help you ensure that across the board, all your episodes will adhere to the platform's technical standards. The other thing that it actually helps us with is it helps to streamline collaboration. So we need to be understanding this at this juncture, that sound is not a one person's job. Sound is a job that is worked on by multiple people. So, for instance, you'll have your sound supervisor, you have your dialogue editor, you have your music designer, you have maybe, I mean, your music composer, you have someone who's gonna do your ambience, your foley, okay, and even just in foley you might spread it out to someone who's doing your footsteps, another one who's doing your body, your cloth sounds, another one who's doing your touch sounds, another one who's doing maybe your breath sounds. So you might spread it across multiple different people. So it is not a one man's job. For this reason, you need a template that allows all of you to collaborate, but on a template that means you're all working on the same platform, as opposed to everyone coming up with their own template, coming up with their own loudness, such that you have elements of inconsistencies when you're collaborating. So let's get to who creates the template. Ideally, when you're working in any sound environment and you have a supervising sound editor, then it's the work of the sound supervisor to come up with a template that would benefit everyone else working in that project. For instance, the sound supervisor would develop a template that the dialogue editor could work on, and also the Foley recordist and also the editor could work on. The ADR engineer could also work on the same template. So you need to create a template that would benefit everyone's needs, such that by the time it comes to the recording mixer or the final mixer, then it is not confusing for this person to understand where everything is, because it was created in collaboration with everyone's needs. It becomes very easy for the final mixer to understand where the reverbs are, where the delays are, where how the routing is done behind Pro Tools. Okay. So the re-recording mixer might, from that template, decide to add a few customizations that would benefit his workflow based on what he intends to do. So once you have done your general template, which we are going to do, it means that once we do our general template, also you can decide to customize this template such that it completely meets your needs. Okay, like we'll look into a situation where we have what we call the dipped versus undipped. So you might find that as someone who's doing music, you might be asked for, if deliverables are dipped versus undipped, you asked for dipped or undipped deliverables in terms of your music and effects. You should be able to customize your template such that you have deliverables or an auxiliary bus that will be enable you give out dipped and undipped music and effects. So we also have the sound editors. The sound editors can also customize a general template that has been created. But at the end of the day, it means by the time this all goes to the re-recording mixer or the final mixer, we have a similar template that does not cause confusion when collaborating. So let's just look at what are some of the key elements of a Pro Tools template for film post-production. We will have track layouts in the form of dialogue, which will be abbreviated by DX. So if you see DX in the tutorial, you'll understand that this refers to dialogues. Okay. Then we'll also have ADR, or automated dialogue replacement. Most films require ADR to be done. So if you need to create tracks for your ADR. Okay. So we'll also have effects or sound effects. So sound effects would be abbreviated by FX or even SFX. And so you can choose, but most people go with FX. And Foley also fall in line with the effects. So you'll have your hard effects, things like gunshots, things like accidents, things like doors slamming and all that, that would maybe fall into your effects. Then we also have music. So we'll have MX for music. So MX is just an abbreviation that will be used to indicate tracks that will hold your music. We'll also have your background elements, which would be your ambiances. So remember, whenever you're doing your film, that every room has its own ambience. Like, it's very unnatural for you to walk into a room and it does not have an ambience. Even the room that I am in right now has its own ambience. So remember that for the entire film, you need to build up the ambience of each and every room, each and every space. So just to demystify something, let us understand that we don't have silence in any film. Most of the time, what we consider or think as silence are layers of ambience that have been built by the sound team. And for this reason, that is why I usually ask that don't let the video editor tamper with anything that the final mixers have done. Once it goes through final mix, that is final. The director should not touch it. The editor should not touch it. The producer should not touch it. Any changes that need to be done on a project need to be done through the final mixer, because there's so many elements that have gone into the making of the film. By the time the editor just chops off something and changes locations, it's not going to sound right. So just remember that. Okay, so other things that you're going to create are some things like auxiliary buses and master bus. Okay, the master fader and auxiliary buses. So auxiliary buses are just for routing, so getting a signal from one point to another for purposes of applying an effect. Okay, that is why we use buses, just taking it from one destination to another destination so that we can process that either track using certain effects. Okay, so we will also need, as we start this, we will need certain plugins. Okay, for instance, because we are going to be working with the platforms that require or have a very specific loudness standard, we are going to require a loudness meter. So there's a couple of free loudness meters out there. One of them like Hoofer, another one is Ulin. If you don't have any of these loudness meters, kindly, this is a good time to, pause this, go download Ulin. Ulin should be free. Hoofer should be free. And if you have any of these other paid loudness meters, you could also use that, okay? Because it's very critical, especially when you're mixing for platforms that have loudness. But allow me to say this. I would say all international platforms today have loudness. Okay, it's only that in African broadcasting, when you go to your local TV stations, that's where there's no loudness, so anything goes. It is chaotic. But when you go to international platforms, inclusive of YouTube, YouTube has its loudness, Spotify has its loudness, Apple has its loudness, Netflix has its loudness, Showmax has its loudness, Mnet has its loudness. So you must understand that you really need a loudness meter, and you also have to master how to use it, because in today's world there is no way you will work on anything without having it subjected to loudness, and part of quality control will be subjecting your program to loudness. A casing example is that in Europe, right now, you're not allowed to broadcast anything that is not aligned to their EBU R128 standard. And in fact, it's against the law for you to broadcast anything that is above minus 23 laughs. You either risk a fine or even closure of your entire broadcast system. For this reason, you realize that if you're also supposed to break into the international market, you must understand what loudness is about. Okay, so let's just quickly now look at the loudness standards for the different platforms. And here, because we're looking at Netflix and Showmax and Mnet, let's just have a look at maybe what is the loudness standard for Netflix, what is expected of you when you're mixing Netflix, so that you can also, we will also actually have to do this in our template such that we make sure that we are around the specified loudness standards. So for Netflix, they require an integrated loudness of minus 27 LKFS, okay? And you're given a plus or minus 2, okay, loudness units for the dialogue. So what does this mean? This means when you're mixing your dialogue, I remember there's a time someone asked me a while back when I was doing some projects. So they called me and asked me, what is the hardest thing that you do when you're doing your final mix? And I was like, dialogue mixing is pretty crazy. And they could not understand what I meant by dialogue mixing. It just did not make sense to them that there's something like dialogue mixing. But allow me to say this. When you're doing your dialogue mixing, you are given certain parameters to work around. And for Netflix, they're telling you that we need the dialogue to, generally, the loudness of the dialogue, the general energy of the dialogue needs to be minus 27. You're not measuring an instantaneous level of loudness. You're measuring the entire level of loudness in terms of the dialogue. And on your loudness meter, it needs to be reading minus 27 once your mix is done. Okay? But they're telling you that they will allow a tolerance of plus or minus 2 loudness units. What does this mean? It means that when you're doing your dialogue, your general dialogue loudness, it can be minus 27, which will still pass QC. It could be plus 2 loudness units, which means it could be minus 26 or even minus 25 on average, the entire loudness of the show, and this will still pass QC. Or it could even go lower to minus 28 or minus 29, and if it goes a plus or minus 2 LU, you're very safe. So if you're to submit your dialogue loudness for Netflix at minus 29 LKFS, it will still pass QC and there will be no problem. But the moment you go below, let's say you go to minus 30 LKFS, then it might fail QC and you might be told to remix your dialogue such that it meets the minus 27 LKFS or it just lies within the allowed range. It's a loudness standard. So LKFS is just a loudness standard. So let us look at something that is called dynamic range. So dynamic range for Netflix. So what really is dynamic range? So when you're mixing, because you will also get into this as we create our template, and I'm hoping the theory aspect of it will shine some light. So when you're mixing for Netflix, they'll ask you for a dynamic range of 10 LU. What does this mean? So for instance, when you're mixing your dialogue, you will understand that in any performance, there is quiet, low whispers, there is general normal talking, and then there is where people shout. Okay. So what Netflix does is they tell you, listen, we are not going to limit you in terms of just putting everything at minus 27. We understand that you have whispers, we understand that you have normal talk, and we understand that you have situations where people shout. So what are you supposed to do? So they are governing how loud you can let your dialogue elements be. So they're telling you, we will let you have a loudness, capacity of 10 loudness units on your dialogue. So while you're mixing your general loudness, when people are talking comfortably and normally at minus 27, they're telling you, for the loud parts, you are allowed to have 5 loudness units above minus 27 for when people are shouting. And for when people are whispering, you're allowed to have 5 loudness units under minus 27 for the whispers, such that your dialogue is not just consistent. Your dialogue will be dynamic, such that we're able to have people shouting and they don't exceed minus 10. And they don't exceed 5 loudness units from minus 27, and when people are whispering, it does not exceed 5 loudness units of under minus 27. So what does this do? This ensures that if your movie, or if it doesn't matter what region you did your films, the dialogue element of all Netflix shows needs to be consistent across all films from whatever place that your movie was mixed. Okay, so what this also means is that if a movie has been mixed in UK and another one has been mixed in Africa, because the dynamic range is limited, you're told where to place your loud parts, where to place your silent parts, and where to place your general talk. When there's a transition between the UK movie to the African movie, no one will have to reach for the remote and start changing levels because the dialogue has either become too loud or the dialogue has either become too quiet. This is why we have some of these quality control measures, such that we have a general, a very interesting viewer experience that does not necessitate us now trying to be final mixers with the remote control. But you'll find that if you listen to your local channel here in Africa, this is the norm of the day. When news begins, you run for the remote. When an advert comes on, you run for the remote. When a soap opera comes up, you again run for the remote, and you're always just afraid of, you don't know what's gonna come next. Whenever you change channels on your signal, on your broadcast frequency, you also have to have the remote at hand so that you change levels. This is not expected in some of these international platforms. User experience is greatly thought of in some of these international platforms, inclusive of Showmax, inclusive of Netflix. So now I want us to look at, there's also something else that you need to understand, which is called the general dynamic range of the entire film. So while Netflix limits you in terms of how you can mix your dialogue, they tell you you can mix your dialogue at minus 27. That's the general loudness of the dialogue. You are allowed to have minus 5 LU of minus 27 and plus 5 LU above minus 27 as your dynamic range. But it does not matter how much of that dynamic range you use. At the end of the day, the general loudness needs to be minus 27 LKFS. Now, the other general dynamic range that we need to consider is the entire show. Once you start bringing in other elements like sound effects, like your HUD effects, when you start bringing in your music, the entire show's dynamic range should not exceed 18 LU. Okay? What does this mean? It means whenever you're doing your final mix for your show, for your Netflix show, you are not supposed to have elements that exceed 18 loudness units, okay, from your general loudness unit that was measured using the dialogue, which was minus 27 LKFS. So what does this tell you? In simple terms, this is what they're trying to say. From minus 27 LKFS, you have 9 units above it to place all the other elements that you want. Okay, you have 9 units above it and 9 units below it that you can place your elements. So assuming you have explosions and you have gunshots and you have very loud elements in your movie, they are asking you that please, whenever you put your explosions and any loud aspects that are not generally dialogue, you have from minus 27, you have 9 loudness units through which you can have this, you can express these loud aspects. So that means if you have minus 27, you'll have minus 26, 25, 24, 23, 22, 21, 20, and then 19. Is that right? No. Minus 27, 26, 25, 24, 23, 22, 21, 20. And then we have 19, so minus 18. So you have up to minus 18 LKFS or even laughs in terms of how you can express yourself with your loud aspects. And you have vice versa with the low aspects. Whatever it is that you put in your film that are going to be low, you need it at 9 loudness units under minus 27, such that you have a balanced program that will not let people reach for their remote. And this is very specific to Netflix, because as we're going to see, Mnet have a slightly different standard. Showmax and Mnet and Showmax have a slightly different standard. So looking at Mnet and Showmax, so Mnet and Showmax have adopted the IBU, the EBU R128 standard, which is the European Broadcast Union standard, and the European Broadcast Union standard says that your general loudness for the entire show needs to be at minus 23 laughs. Okay, I think they also give you minus 2 and plus 2, so they are telling you that at minus 24 or minus 25 you're safe, and they're also saying that at minus 22 or minus 21 you're still safe for the general programming. But they also give you, I think, 15 dBs of loudness range that you can play around with. So that tells you again you have about 7 loudness units from minus 23 up above for your loud parts, and 7 units above under minus 23 for your silent parts. So you must make sure that you meet the specified loudness target for your dialogue or for the general programming, and also consider the dynamic range, because if your QC fails the dynamic range, you're going to have to do corrections. So why does loudness and dynamic range actually matter? So how it works is consistency. Loudness and dynamic range provides consistency across the entire shows. So it means if you properly mix your show from the first show to the last show, it's going to be very consistent in terms of dynamic range and loudness. And if someone is watching a series, no one will reach for the remote to try and adjust because now they can't hear dialogue, or now the explosions have become too high. And for instance, some of us watch some of these platforms while we are dozing. You don't have to be woken up by very loud explosions because you were sleeping, and then all of a sudden this thing disrupts you. Okay? We want very nice user experience at the end of the day. While you're watching from home, you don't constantly reach for your remote. I know that our local broadcasters do not care about this, and maybe it's about time that even the governing bodies step in and trying to enforce some of these rules with regards to loudness. But I remember meeting someone who actually introduced me properly to this whole loudness matter. His name was Quinton. He used to work for MultiChoice, and he's the one who was very strict on matters loudness, and he was pushing me always to make sure that when I mix, my mixing meets the appropriate loudness standards. Okay, and it was because he cared for the user experience, but you'll find so many other people don't care for user experience. So we need to start caring for ourselves. As an engineer, a mixing engineer, start caring for the experience that people will have at home. Don't wait for the governing bodies to come at you and tell you that you need to mix at these levels. Let us start doing this as common practice, just so that we care about our listenership, we care about the user experience at the end of the day. So maybe I just want to touch on, okay, so also when why dynamic range and loudness matters is it also ensures compliance. So you'll end up being compliant with different platforms, okay, based on the loudness, but also helps you pass quality control. Because at the end of the day, when you subject your work to Netflix, it's going to go through quality control. When you subject your work to Showmax, it's going to go through quality control. And to avoid failures in quality control, please make sure that your loudness and your dynamic range meet the specified quality control measures that you've been given by the broadcast company or by the platform. So I want us to talk about something that is usually asked for at international levels, and these are called dipped versus undipped deliverables. So what are they? So dipped deliverable means that when you see this in the quality control sheet, when you're being asked to provide a dipped deliverable, they're asking for your M&E or your music and effects in a manner that is dipped, okay? But dipped deliverables are usually go with uh, titles or movies or even series that will only be showcased in a specific language. Okay, if the language that it was recorded in is the language that is gonna be released in, then you'll be asked for the dipped M&E. But there's also what we call the undipped deliverable, and undipped, it means that this show is supposed to go undergo what we call global delivery. In other words, it's going to be dubbed in other languages such that by the time it is being released, it can be released in Spanish, it can be released in Portuguese, it could be released in English, it could be released in Afrikaans, it could be released in Swahili. For this reason, you will be asked for an undipped deliverable, which would mean you need to have a track where your music and effects are not dipped. Okay, by dipping we mean whenever there's dialogue, we usually ride our faders, our music fader, and sometimes our effects faders under the dialogue so that dialogue is clear, and then once the dialogue is over, we ride back up. So they're asking you to give them music and effects that don't have that ride information. It is just flat, such that by the time they do their dubbing in different languages, it can be mixed again. It will be given to different people to mix now based on the native language, and to duck under the dialogue based on the different native language that it's been dubbed to. Okay, so let me just see what I also need to cover. Yeah, so because today we are going to just be considering doing this in stereo. We'll also do this in 5.1. And the reason why I think we need to start with stereo is because once you've understood how to do stereo, it becomes very easy to do 5.1 and other immersive aspects of filmmaking. But if you don't get stereo, it means it will be very hard for you to get the other aspects of 5.1, 7.1, and maybe even Dolby Atmos, because the foundational aspect of most of these immersive setups is usually stereo. And not just stereo in terms of mixing, also stereo in terms of recording, stereo in terms of what elements do you need in stereo when you're recording and how to go about them. So this particular template will be done in stereo, and the next tutorial that we'll do will develop a 5.1 template that you can actually monitor in stereo, such that if you don't have a 5.1 setup, you can just mix in stereo and then hopefully go find a facility that has proper 5.1 setup, and now do your final mix in 5.1. And in similar way, also you realize that maybe if you're doing Dolby Atmos, you could mix on your headphones for Dolby Atmos, and then you find a facility that has the proper speaker configuration and setup for Dolby Atmos, let's say a 7.1.4, and then you go and do your final mix for that for Dolby Atmos. For this reason, I want to say this, that we have no excuse for not exploring some of these immersive platforms. In finality on this, I just want to say this. If there's something that I've learned in the industry, and maybe I would want some of you to learn, is this: that learn to value relationships more than money. Because ideally, at the end of the day, the doors that relationships will open for you are doors that money will never see. Okay, so learn to value relationships more than money. So as you work with different people, learn to have a good relationship with everyone, learn to communicate properly with everyone, because communication is the thing that ties filmmakers together. How you communicate through each stage. Poor communication will lead to bad quality work. So from the highest person, who might be a producer or an executive producer, to whoever it is that you consider low, consider proper communication, okay? And value relationships above money. That will take you places that money will never take you. And so let's jump into our first tutorial that will be creating a Pro Tools template for Netflix and Showmax that will enable us give them the required deliverables as per their quality control. Thank you.